So very good morning, and I'd just like to get a sense of who's in the room, although I did briefly meet everybody yesterday at the dinner. From government, private sector, civil society, and regional and national internet organizations, broadly to get a sense. So who's from government? Anybody from government? Yeah, 2 people from government. From civil society groups? Okay. From regional and national internet organizations? Okay. And the private sector? Okay. Thank you so much. So how many of you believe you work towards gender equality in your work? The intention is important. Don't worry about the outcomes. Yeah. So others are also getting there. The third question, how many of you don't believe in gender equality? Don't have to raise your hands, it's a trick question. Okay, so, and my fourth submission is the good thing about understanding and talking about gender issues is that every one of us has an opinion. There are issues and topics and themes in a classroom about which we may know very little, about which we may be agnostic, but gender is an issue about which all of us have an opinion. And why I preface my talk with this comment is that I would really like to appeal to all of you to close your computers, your laptops, and your gadgets, and completely throw yourself into this class, for better or for worse, because 90 minutes to give Anita Gurumurthy's lecture is not a big deal in your life. And at the end of it, if it's not really enriching or rewarding, it's fine. You can give me a bad rating. However, these 90 minutes may be life-changing. Not because it's my lecture, but because these 90 minutes belong to us, and there might be an insight we have on gender justice, and gender equality that we take back with us. And that's the intention of all learning processes. So that's a request. I don't have any moral authority over anybody here, but I would certainly like to preface my talk with this appeal. I come from an organization called IT for Change, and we do a range of things, but broadly our perspective is informed by social justice and gender justice, and we work on internet policy issues. Gender is at the very core of what we do, because we really believe that location, where we are situated, our life experiences, our histories are very important to how we experience the internet. So with that, I'd like to begin this conversation. And as I said, this is not my lecture, but these 90 minutes belong to us to shape. There are many things in the world, many concepts, the semantics of which are not shared. By that I mean, a word like empowerment can mean many things to many people. And therefore, it's really important we have a shared understanding for the purposes of this talk. So let's unpack empowerment. Many people have tried to do this. Many scholars have really tried to engage with ideas of power. Foucault has done that, if you've heard of Michel Foucault. Anthony Giddens has done it. Many feminist scholars have done it. Naila Kabir from Bangladesh, who used to work with the Institute of Development Studies, is one such scholar, and I really like her definition. I thought I would share it with you. So she says, it's the expansion in the ability that people have to make strategic life choices in a context where this ability was previously denied to them. So the whole idea is that many times we don't really know there is a choice. Time permitting, at the end of this, and if I don't eat into lunch too much, I'd like to show you a 3-minute or 4-minute clip about a project that we've just concluded working with adolescent girls. The most beautiful part of that process was that the girls who were working with technology did not know that they had many choices. The choice not to get married early, the choice to actually dream that they can find employment, the choice to dream that they can go ahead and study. So these are things that we take for granted, because as middle class intellectuals, we often believe that we have the choice. But many people really don't know that there is a universe outside of their immediate context that exists in which they can make choices. So the idea of strategic life choices is very important in the definition of empowerment. So empowerment is not just having access perhaps to, let's say, consumption of a good. It means to be able to have the intellectual prowess and the ability to choose between options. And an important thing is that it's a process. Why is it a process? A slave in the feudal system did not have an option, and subsequently through a process of revolution, perhaps that option presents itself. So the context should be such that you don't have those choices, then you have the ability to make those choices. So every one of these words is very important in the definition of empowerment. What I want to say also is that empowerment, therefore, is a process. It's not like an end journey, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of people in this room feel very empowered. Some of us may not feel empowered. But even for those of us who feels empowered, it's not a static thing. Suddenly we may be confronted by situations where we don't feel empowered. So empowerment is a very ongoing process, and we see this all the time, that people with a disadvantage, maybe LGBTIQ groups, or people like marginalized rural women, people who are struggling, they actually come to a point where they make a gain. There's a law that's passed, that brings them some gain. But maybe because of the course of democracy, and because democracy is essentially chaotic, suddenly they reach a milestone where it's 2 steps back. So then you have to think about what went wrong. So in that sense, it's an ongoing process. And oftentimes when we talk about choice, it's an extremely difficult thing that the courts are always struggling with, philosophers are always struggling with. What's real choice? I mean, there's choice, but what's real choice? I mean, when you are signing up and taking the opportunity that Facebook offers to network, and you know that you have to part with your personal data to do so, it's a Faustian deal. It's like, I give you my data, and in return you give me the potential to network free, right? So you're not very sure, is that a real choice or is it a choice? But let's let that to rest for some time. The other important thing that Naila Kabir says is that making choices should not come with very punishingly high costs. I mean, what's the deal, right? Many times you have to struggle and struggle and struggle to get something, but at the end of it, you're exhausted. And I can tell you of innumerable cases of rape victims who decide to take recourse to the law, and they decide that they would go up to a court of law to fight their case. And the entire process of that, judicial investigation is so painful and humiliating that you feel at the end of it that maybe someone else, like the feminists or the middle class feminists in the country, are gaining, but I'm not gaining as a victim who was raped. So it's very important to keep all these things in mind. So let's come to the digital opportunity. I'm going to state a few things which will not be very controversial initially, because we all agree that the internet has brought some tremendous gains to us. And this is not just for women's groups, but it's true for many people who are disadvantaged, people who do not have a voice, people who, because of their identity and location, find themselves marginalized. So the internet has brought the gains of translocal networking. Jurisdictions matter, but maybe they don't. Sometimes they matter a lot, and sometimes you're able to subvert the territorial boundaries of law, the territorial boundaries of the nation state. So one very important thing in this regard is information access, and the other is networks of support. So for many people, if you really look at liberation movements in the Asia-Pacific region, a lot of activists, who worked in Burma or in the context of Burma actually were based out of Thailand. The same is true for many such social movements where people are able to use the internet and people are able to connect with solidarity groups across nation states and across borders. The case study of women on web that I've put out here is, does anybody know about this? Okay, yeah. Just to tell you briefly, this was an organization that used to entertain emails. It was based out of the US. This organization wanted to share information about sexual and reproductive health. So information basically about emergency contraception, emergency abortion pills, etc. And they used to receive millions of emails. What happened was somebody told Facebook that their content is prejudicial. So immediately, without any investigation, Facebook pulled down their page. Then everybody networked, and then what Women on Web was able to establish is that every single thing that they were doing was in conformity with WHO's rules on information sharing, that women need information and women don't have information, especially about things that matter to them a lot, about their bodily integrity. So then Facebook tendered an apology. This happened very recently. So this is one of those cases where the organization came back. Of course, I don't have to underscore the significance of economic gains for women because of networking. In Malaysia, for instance, you have homemakers who, because of various cultural contexts, and you could well say maybe out of their own choices as well, choose to remain at home and work on the internet. And for those women, it's really important that they are able to do so and benefit economic empowerment because of flexible workspaces that the internet allows. Similarly, in contexts like India, you have digital enterprises. Rural Shores is one of those social venture capital firms that believes that they should take work to where women are rather than have women migrate into small towns. So this is one experiment at organizing the ITES industry. Of course, I think global trends because of artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, 3D printing, all of this has really posed a very big question mark, and I have no doubt in my mind that in the future years, APSIG will have to grapple with the question of the future of jobs, the future of the economy, on account of the fact that the internet and internet technologies have more or less rendered redundant many jobs. Many skill sets are now able to be automated. Of course, STEM careers is a very important thing. And one thing I want to say is that the internet is not one abstract thing, right? What the internet does is, as a general purpose technology, it disappears into the different sectors. So for somebody, the internet is a place for social interaction. For someone else, the internet is a place for entertainment. For the third person, the internet is a very important thing for counseling. And for the fourth person, the internet is a medium of marketing. So in some sense, it's a general purpose technology that disappears into the different sectors and acquires a meaning of its own. And therefore, what a lot of people believe is that through STEM careers, women can find newer and newer niches of employment in different sectors of the economy. I do not have to also make a case for this. Everybody knows that if there is one radical idea of the 20th century that managed to bring democracy to center stage, that is the idea of the internet. And nobody really imagined that the geographies of political action will transform so much, but it's thanks to the internet that today you're able to actually come up and lend support to people across the world, and people are able to mobilize as well. So the first illustration here, the image that I've put, is women who organized when Trump got elected. And the second is the whole idea that, for instance, as an Arab woman, I might have the right to drive a car. So social norms can be challenged. Now, it's very important while talking about gender issues to understand that right and wrong is very negotiated, it's highly cultural, but thanks to certain global standards and on gender equality, thanks to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which came after the Human Rights Treatises, there are certain global benchmarks on what is right and wrong. You might have your issues with that, but that still is something that is to be negotiated with your community, with your society, with your lawmakers. An interesting thing, though, is that very often that the last bastion of struggle with respect to gender equality is the household. So, you might actually be a public figure, but many times you might have to fight your battles back at home. So this is something we'll come back to later, so just hold on. So quickly, to give you an idea of the development discourse, where are gender equality principles in relation to the internet articulated in global dialogues? So I will just take you through three things. Many institutions exist, and many institutions in the internet space have attempted to articulate the principle of gender equality. Back in 1995, when some of you may have been toddlers, was the Beijing Platform for Action. So the Section J of Beijing Platform, in those days, people just thought there are advertisements that show women in compromised situations, and that's not on, because there is a certain modicum of dignity that women have, and they should be represented in non-sexualized forms. So Section J was about media, and it emphasized that women's access to the expanding digital super information highways should be kept in mind, and women should have access. Tunis agenda of the World Summit of the Information Society, about which I'm sure you will hear in the next couple of days, also highlighted the need to bridge the gender digital divide and ensure women's fullest participation in the information society. Then, of course, the SDGs debate, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. Goal 5B recognizes ICTs as enabling technologies for women's empowerment. Don't worry if all this is too much jargon, you can always read up later on, but to just emphasize that the idea that technologies should enable women to participate in this information society, in the network society, has been underscored by these global instruments. I want to also say one important thing, that if you actually critically look at these things, one thing is missing. What these statements don't do is that they don't actually say that even if women participate, what kind of a context is the space of the intersection between gender and internet. So very often we say women must participate in politics. We say women must be part of boardrooms. We say women must come up and be part of governing institutions. But we don't ask the question, are we going to have or aim towards structural transformation of these spaces? Because equality doesn't obtain just by somebody stepping into a space. Do you all agree with me? Or maybe is this for something to discuss later? What I mean is that structures of discrimination or ideologies of discrimination are very much part of people's conversations. They are the subtext. So all of them, all these statements exhorting countries and nation states to endeavor to bring women to the forefront are not really thinking about what needs to be done to prevent the barriers, because structures of injustice are not just 2 years old or 20 years old. They're really epochal. They've been existing, even in the myths. So in some sense, they're part of our imaginaries. They're in our head. So I'm going to quickly take you through some statistics. When you look at the global gender divide, and again, don't worry too much if you don't like graphs. Many people, I just find it very challenging to look at a graph and tell a story. But this is a very important graph. So decode it at your time. What it says is that 80% of women in developed countries are accessing the internet, 37% in developing countries, and just 12.5% in least developed countries. So it's not just if you are a woman that you're disadvantaged in terms of accessing the internet. You are doubly disadvantaged if you come from a developing country, and many times more disadvantaged if you come from a least developed country. So what it really says is the politics of internet infrastructure, the way it's provisioned, policies around market, policies about public policies about backbones, broadband, mobiles, all of this really matters. And what you actually see is that there is a certain historical disadvantage in the world in terms of inequality that is also getting aggravated, that is getting amplified in the internet space. So traditional structures of inequality are mirrored in terms of the gender divide. So it's not just about being a woman, but a woman and other kinds of locations. So if you're in an urban slum, for instance, you're not likely to have access to good quality internet. Maybe I'm stating the obvious, but this is very important to register. The second thing is the access trap. This was used a few years ago in one of the reports, and I thought it's a very interesting conception, because when demand is low, then the market players, the internet service providers, hesitate to go into those areas, which is common sense, right? But that leads to a kind of a vicious cycle which pushes demand even lower. And then there is absolutely no incentive for market players to go in there. So this is the kind of thing, which is the chicken and egg. Should internet access come first or relevant content come first? This is like kingdom come, we can discuss this question, but it's to say that the world's poorest women will not be automatically included into market-led diffusion or connectivity, therefore exhorting us to think about the ways in which post-market or non-market interventions may become very, very important. This is where the role of public policy is. The shocking thing is that contrary to popular belief that internet penetration is growing, what the ITU is telling us, what the Broadband Commission is telling us is, hey, wait a minute, internet growth rates are not going up. They're slowing down in the 48 poorest countries, despite 85% of the population still being offline. Why I say this is that we may be able to make a strong case that take internet and put it in the hands of women and girls and see that the world will be a better place, it will be a gender just place. But that's not going to happen automatically, is what I'm trying to say. This may again seem very commonsensical, but it's important to put on the table. There are socio-structural divides. There are divides on account of income, on account of education, on account of access to employment, and all these things intersect with the way in which your felicity to use the internet differs. So if your education level is really low, what you might do with mobile data is very different from if your education level is very high. Although this seems commonsensical, I think it's really, really important to understand that when we talk about the gender divide, we're also saying that historically women have not been in the political space, they have not been in the educational space as much as boys, and they do not have, there are innumerable studies that conclude that women don't have direct access to income in many agricultural households where the wages may just be handed over to the man. And then is the whole question of surveillance. Surveillance is not a big idea which is connected with debates around Snowden, debates around what's happening to how the US is snooping on Germany, etc. Surveillance is a very commonplace activity that's eons old, and we've always surveilled our daughters. We always surveil our sisters. We're very, very caring, and therefore we want to follow them everywhere and make sure they don't talk to boys and they don't talk to the wrong people. And household level barriers, which are surveillance practices, show tremendous gendered patterns such that surveillance actually at the level of the community, there is this extremely famous context of the Cup Panchayats in India, Pakistan, and South Asia, where the community law making mechanisms decide that girls in this village will not have access to a mobile phone. Very many times girls have actually reported that they are quite wary of making friends on Facebook because their brothers are watching. People have also said, and there is a deep paradox here talking about strategic choices. If you lived in an ideally free and liberal society where you could wear what you wanted, befriend who you wanted, then there would be no need to go through mediators, right? I mean, I have 2 daughters, and the reality is that when they step out on the street, I worry about them. Now, I wouldn't have to be worried if the universe was a perfect place and there was no crime. Therefore, when you do research on issues of surveillance, you actually have women and girls reporting that they are very happy to have a mobile phone because if they are in situations of risk, they are able to call back or connect their friends. So when you talk about choices, you have to understand that technology, the mobile phone itself, can be an instrument of stalking, of doxing, of trolling, and therefore the space of the internet is actually a kind of a seamless continuing space which mirrors and represents the very same inequalities that is present in this room, that's present in this world. So the question is, if we manage to bridge the gender-digital divide, if we bring up education, if we bring up internet access, if we provide internet access to everybody, is it still enough? Will women actually become empowered? So I'm going to state an obvious adage. Empowerment is not just about being connected, it's about the quality of the connectivity experience. Economists in this room will tell us that the internet is an experience good. So economics defines an experience good as something that is understood only with consumption. That is, the more you use it, the more you will have use for it. You know, it's profoundly liberating to know this, right? I mean, you use the internet, you then stumble upon something, you stumble upon more things, and then it starts becoming useful to you, and therefore the internet is called an experience good. Now, the quality of your experience on the internet is really, really important. Now, what does research tell you on the quality of experience that women have through connectivity? All is not very well. In a study in 10 countries that was done, it was found that connectivity, for instance, among female internet users on social media allows 48%, that is nearly 50% of those who were surveyed, and this is all in urban slums. All these women reported that they had connected to others, so either through social networking sites or something. But only 21% said that they had actually searched for meaningful information on the internet. So what you're actually seeing is, although we think that the knowledge economy is on the internet, that's not so self-evident to many people. Which is why many people actually believe that the purpose of having data on the mobile phone is to just network. Now, I'm not making a judgment about that, because networking can be potentially rewarding. But what I'm saying is that as an experience good, somebody needs to tell you that the internet is actually a treasure trove of information, and someone else has to put in the content there in a language and in a medium that you recognize and that you can identify with. But again, all is not well with the world. It seems to be a dreary morning here in Bangkok, and I'm going to give you one more set of statistics that tells a sad story. What you're actually seeing in the latest reports from the ITU is that there is a huge difference between developed and developing countries in terms of the consumption of kilobits per second. So if you're in developed countries, per second you consume 93 kilobits, and if you're in developing countries, it's 13 kilobits per second, and if you're in the LDCs, it's just 1 kilobit per second. Can you imagine? Women actually need video streamed content because the largest numbers of illiterate people in the world are women, right? And if you actually have 1 kilobit per second, speed quality of the internet, what kind of streaming video can you actually even dare to imagine you can consume? Isn't that a question that we have to be concerned with? So this is why some feminist groups have actually said, very evocatively, how do you write a complete biography of a woman activist from the global south when the most reliable sources of knowledge about her may be locked up in oral texts, in oral discourses, or recorded only in small, local, non-English publications? How do you write full, accurate coverage of trans rights issues when the neutral point of view presumes views of straight, cisgender white men as the neutral default, while reliable sources don't accurately reflect transgender lives? So the whole idea of a Wikipedia, which in principle as the knowledge commons is a tremendous experiment in the internet age, is valid. We would still like to question who is actually creating this knowledge. And therefore, the future of the knowledge society is already being created by those with certain privilege. So this is the most difficult thing, that you take the internet, you hold it up as a neutral kind of device, and then eventually you discover that it's not exempt from social norms. And it's a kind of tragic realization that unless you kind of talk about gender justice, gender equality and inequality, you're not really going to be able to alter the fabric of the internet, because if you're a woman, it's bad enough, you're going to be trolled. If you're a woman politician or a woman in public spaces, all our ministers, female ministers in our country, are regularly and routinely trolled, so including our Minister for Women. So she actually set up a site which said, we are going to discuss the gender policy for India, and promptly on the very same day she was trolled. So the whole idea is, if you're a woman, you dare not have any opinions, So that's the kind of subtext that the internet is working with. There's a certain normalization of sexism and misogyny on the internet. And there's a certain trivialization that happens. So celebrities will say things freely, political commentators will say things freely, and there's a trivialization, there's a normalization. I can't imagine that 20 years ago that the leadership of a country can come up and say, it's okay to rape women. But today, with impunity, people in the internet space are able to say this. And the jurisdictional issues are complicating matters, because what do you do when maybe free speech laws and right to information laws are also being changed, modified in the parliaments to keep up with internet times so that it can protect the elite. And that's actually happening in the Asia Pacific. Many countries are going back and amending their laws in very retrograde ways. Then there is, of course, a protectionist lens. Go up and speak, but be very careful about what you say. And what's the big deal then? I mean, if I can't say what I want to say, then what's the point of the internet? Then there's the whims of the internet intermediaries. Sometimes, like the example I gave you in the first instance, women on the web was giving important information. Somebody didn't like them, and that's the some activists against the the organization, and they complained to Facebook. Facebook did not listen to any appeals from the organization. It just decided to bring down the content, right? So what do? There are these whims. And I think we should understand that there's a network data complex. States and corporations, I think there's a certain threat perception because citizens are acting up. And because of this, I think these are early times, and therefore there is a certain knee-jerk response. There's a collusion with corporate actors everywhere. Data analytics firms are big game. Political propaganda is generating fake news machines. And so even before elections, during elections, after elections, every time news is, highly doctored and engineered. And we live in that reality, and that reality is extremely misogynistic. There are constant violations on menstrual apps. People are putting in a lot of money, organizations that are in philanthropy, to design safety apps, to design apps on helping women during, to collect menstrual data. Does your stomach ache, does your back ache, and all of that. And all that data is being taken away from your mobile phones without your consent. So how can policies and programs unlock empowerment? I think at the very basic level is the question of universal access, right? Access comes first, and without access you can't even be talking. This morning Professor Chon asked, I wondered if it was tongue-in-cheek, that if you really don't know how to use the internet, we have to begin at the beginning, and therefore it's important. And I wanted to really say that a study that was done by the ITU actually found out that the universal service obligation funds of countries are oftentimes used for broadband connection, remote and rural area connection. They're used even for disabilities, for people with disability and their accessibility online, so that you can create websites that are in consonance with accessibility standards. However, very few governments are able to think about using the use of for purposes of gender inclusion. And there are certain case studies in India, Malaysia, and the Philippines. For instance, Malaysia has used this to counsel people who are in drug abuse, and these are specifically targeted at women. In India, there have been programs on using an information plus approach to data on mobiles, but there's a very big problem here, because many times our laws, telecommunication laws, are not really up to speed. And the laws might just apply to voice telephony, for instance, and then you don't know what you can do in the mobile telephony space. The Philippines has an extremely strong gender budgeting and gender mainstreaming law, on account of which the use of funds have to be also spent for inclusion of people from gender minorities. The other option is universalizing data allowance, which is something that's repeatedly coming up these days. Even in the free basics debate, the whole question was, is there a case to be made, just like we have rations? In India, we have food grains that are distributed to poor people, free housing for the very poor, or free education for the poorest, and different countries in the region have different policies. There's a question that's being asked, is there a case to be made of giving free data to people? The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, for instance, has taken a progressive position on this. It says, yes, 100 whatever Mbps data should be given. And this question still remains. After you distribute data, the commonsensical thing is people are going to sit and watch pornography. Well, that's a reality. Then what do you then do to change cultures of content? What do you do to change e-government? Can e-government become aggressive in a positive sense, that it actually is able to communicate to people their rights? Then people will start using e-government. So what, if they consume entertainment, so what if they consume pornography? Of course, that's a different debate. The point is that the free data should also empower people. That's the point I'm trying to make. Countries in the developed world have detailed plans. In Spain, there is a plan to expand women's internet access. And NGOs are being roped in order to take the internet to people. The same is true for the UK, where there's a Women and Broadband Initiative of UK. I'm not focusing too much on that because they are good examples to look at your leisure, but they don't belong strictly to this region. South Korea has done extraordinary work, and I mean, even as early as 2003 and 4, they were educating migrants who came into Seoul City, for instance, to use the internet. So that was called the informatization program, and at that time there was a lot of significance being given to this from the Prime Minister's office. And lots of women, we talk about digital literacy programs as if there's one meaning of digital literacy. Like everyone understands digital literacy means this. But digital literacy obviously is like, it's a term like education. What does education mean? I mean, it's not like going to kindergarten, right? Education means layers of complexity, right? And it means also levels and layers. And therefore, when you think digital literacy, you really have to think about who to target, for what. Are you just going to teach them how to operate a computer so that they can send emails or browse Google? What are you going to teach them about? Are you going to teach them how to unpack fake news? Are you going to teach them how to access grievance redressal portals in case you're unhappy with something? Are you going to teach them that this is the helpline and you can talk about it? Are you going to teach them how to blog? I think these are socio-political questions that come very close to digital literacy policies. I would like to also talk about two other examples. One is how governments can consciously take the internet to people to enable them to collectivize. So one of the examples I've given here, which comes from Kerala, India, is that the government, in order to frame its policies around health, policies around different public issues, comes up with a question which then it seeks answers from the most rural and marginalized women. So the system that it has set up is that in rural areas there will be a center, which is a facilitated access point. Someone is sitting there, and that person will take your views and opinions, and as a collective you can come up on a Sunday morning and then say, we have debated this and we feel that this should be written. And in this portal there have been instances where the minister has come back and answered individual queries. Similarly, eTESDA, which is this is the vocational development wing of the Philippines, has done some extraordinary work. Because of the gender budgeting law in the Philippines, the vocational department provides lifelong learning, which means at any point in time you can do long distance education. And this is slightly different from open educational systems, because the internet allows you to pace your own learning, right? You don't have to apply today and take up the exams 8 months down the line. On the internet you can actually pace it. The wonderful experiments of eTESDA are that there are workers from the region who go to Dubai, West Asia for instance, and many of them are stuck there because their skill levels are very low. What eTESDA has done is it has in the embassy in Dubai a learning center, a virtual learning center where house helps and maids who go to Dubai from the Philippines can sign up for a course and come. And so these are the kind of innovations. I'm getting slightly afraid because my time is going to be up. But now I just wanted to leave you with a question, and this is, I have 2 more slides after this, and if possible, I'd like to also show a 3-minute clip right at the end after the discussions. I think empowerment cannot be a Hobson's choice. In 17th century England, there was this gentleman called Hobson who used to sell horses. The idea was you came into the stable and he would tell you, you can pick up a horse, but provided it's from the first stable, which means take it or leave it. A Hobson's choice means you can do this much, but if you want to take these opportunities, take them. But you can't really ask too many questions, right? So I want to leave you with this thought about, and that's because I wanted to talk about the whole case study. How many of you were able to read it? You can be honest, don't worry. I also don't read things that are sent to me the previous night. Amrita, there was one more person. Half means you're able to read half a page. So I really wanted to say that it's a nice, interesting case study because it has the dilemmas of, it's a nice story. It says, it's a free basics case study. So it says there's this country, it's not like a very rich country. It's struggling. It's in the developing world. I mean, incidentally, this is Bangladesh. It doesn't matter. It could be anywhere else. And there's an organization. And the organization is called Saheli. And they really work for reproductive rights information of women, right? They want to send information. They can't afford it because, first of all, some women they work with have smartphones, and they're thinking, well, how do you reach them information about health, nutrition, etc.? And then suddenly, Free Basics comes up to them and says, let's enter into a partnership. Then someone has told Saheli, don't tie up with private sector because they will take away the data of poor women. Then they are in a dilemma. So they go back to the drawing board and they think about it. And then they finally decide, let's go with it. So the case study is asking you to consider, did they do the right thing? I was talking about the Faustin deal that we all, the story of the Faustin deal in mythology. The whole thing is someone was so fond of knowledge that he decided that he will sell his soul to the devil because he wants knowledge, he wants power. So all of us want data. All of us want to stare into the machine even when the lecturer appeals to you to not stare into the machine. That's our soul, which seamlessly gets integrated into the network society. It's nobody's fault. That's because of the way in which it's designed, and it's not all non-manipulative. It's not all harmless. It brings with it a lot of dilemmas. Now, I'm giving you the answer. You can debate about the case. See, the answer here is not, I'm not going to speak pro-Saheli, I'm not against or for the decision of the organization, but I want to say that in a research done by Learn Asia, it was found that as many as 65% of people in Nigeria felt that Facebook was the internet. So when you ask them what the internet is, they said, I have internet, I've used internet, Facebook, because they don't know there is an alternative conception of a universe. So I actually want to know that when you're taking up this journey of empowerment, and I'm coming back to this very evocative visual, it's really important what you determine is your goal. Where do you want to really go in terms of the directions for equality, and how do you want to implement systemic change? So there are new laws you have to think about. There are old laws which you need to modify. But finally, if you do not democratize social structures, new laws, innumerable, right? Right to access is a new law. There's a Marco Civil da Internet in Brazil. Many countries are contemplating, is right to access a basic right. In India, you're actually having court cases around the whole thing. There's a Magna Carta on the internet in the Philippines that's going to be tabled in the parliament. So right to access is a new right, right to digital literacy, right to data protection, right to explanation in the general data protection principles of EU, which are going to kick in from 2018. You can't take away data without consent, but what is consent? Informed consent. If you have informed consent, then you can make strategic choices. If you don't have information, how do you make strategic choices? Just by ticking terms and conditions and saying, yes, take away my data. Then there are old laws, right to participate, right to bodily integrity, right to be heard, right to privacy, right to free speech. All these rights in the internet age are going to get complicated. But even if you make these changes in law, democratizing social structures from the household to the market and democratizing technostructures. By that I mean institutions. I also mean the way in which the internet is governed. Who governs it? For instance, I would like to forward to all of you a beautiful letter that people of Amazon have written, on this GTLD debate on .amazon. I have 1 minute, but I can take those 58 seconds to say that people of Amazon are saying, this case on Amazon. Now, when I say Amazon, Are you thinking about the Amazonian rainforest, or are you thinking about Amazon online? People are asking the question, should you be thinking rainforests, or should you be thinking Amazon? You know, governments are not consulting us. The private sector is interested in the GTLD. It wants it, obviously. I mean, tomorrow, .amazon, like .beauty. L'Oreal applied for .beauty. And then women didn't ask the question, wait a minute, who decides what's beautiful, you know? I mean, why should they privatize and corporatize and enclose the idea of Amazon? Who is asking women? Who is asking people? Is the question I want to leave you with.
Please?
Yes?
Okay.